Welcome everyone. And first of all, I would like to bring your attention to the fact that this event is recorded. It may be published online. I'm not sure yet if it will happen, but please feel free to turn off your camera if you prefer not to have your face recorded. My name is Manon Bery. I'm a PhD student in international law at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. And I'm very grateful that you decided to join us today on International Lesbian Day, actually, for this conversation that is entitled Gender Theory in Practice. This event is part of a week-long workshop on queer methods in international law that we organized with my dearest colleagues, Juliana Santos de Carvalho, Lena Holzer, and Berenice Caprischram. It's organized by the International Law Department and the Gender Center of the Graduate Institute with the support of the Swiss Institute for Feminist Legal Studies and Gender Law. So we organized this workshop as a journey where all travelers are transiting from one station to the other. And this is actually the very last station of this workshop. So today we're going to travel through feminist and queer theories that we broadly term as gender theory. And we will see their interactions with human rights concerns related to sexual orientation and gender identity, and we'll question what it means for the interaction between theory and practice of international human rights law. To guide us through this journey, it's my great honor to welcome two very special travelers today. So our two speakers for the station, Dianne OTTO and Victor Madrigal-BORLOZ. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation, despite being based in seemingly irreconcilable time zones. So it's currently 7 a.m. in New York and 10 p.m. in Melbourne. Thank you so much for being here at this crazy times and for making this event possible. So Dianne OTTO needs no introduction, but for the sake of a habit, she's a professorial fellow at the University of Melbourne. Her broad field of research includes addressing gender identity, sexuality, and race inequalities in the context of international human rights law, but also the transformative potential of civil society initiatives and many more research interests. She's a pioneer in the development of feminist and queer international legal perspectives and has edited the first monograph on queer approaches to international law that was published in 2018. And Victor Madrigal-BORLOZ also does not need introduction. He's a jurist, senior visiting researcher at the Harvard Law School's Human Rights Program. And of course, he's the United Nations independent expert on violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Since the beginning of his mandate in 2018, he showed his tireless engagement in the fight against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity worldwide. And in his capacity of independent experts in 2021, he published 2 reports on gender theory. So the first one is entitled The Law of Inclusion. It was presented in June to the Human Rights Council. And the second one is about practices of exclusion. And it will be presented to the General Assembly in a few weeks. I will actually write a bit later the links to these reports in the chat. So I propose that we take these reports as the starting point of the conversation. Victor could start by presenting the report, and then Dianne will have the floor to explain a bit more her experience with gender theory and international human rights law. Then we'll have a conversation, and I will make sure to keep at least 20 minutes for a Q&A with all the travelers in the audience. So don't hesitate to already write your questions in the chat during the conversation, and my fellow moderators will note them and will ask them during the Q&A. Voila, if we were not online, I would ask for a great round of applause right now for our speakers. But for now, without any further ado, I will give the floor first to Victor Madrigal-Borlozz for him to tell us a bit more about his report on gender theory. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mano. I trust that you can hear me well.
Yes,
Wonderful.
we can.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, wherever you're joining. It's wonderful to be here. And of course, it's wonderful to be taking part on this conversation. I'm just really delighted for this invitation, very thankful. As you know, the mandate of the independent expert was created under significant international controversy with the essential purpose of, on one hand, providing visibility to the way in which violence and discrimination occurs in the everyday life of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and gender diverse persons, as well as in some aspects of intersex lived experience, and then to advise states in relation to the effective measures that can be taken to address such violence and discrimination. I'm also, within that context, very keenly aware of the mandate to explore root causes and main discrimination drivers. And since the very beginning of my work, it became very evident that one of the crucial discussions being held at international level was that of the place that gender as a concept, as a framework, has under international human rights law, which is at the base of implementation of my mandate. And I found it important, far beyond than interesting, which it also is. I found it important and essential at some point to carry out an inquiry into the placement of gender in international human rights law that is at the base of so many conversations that are taken by quarters that in very many cases are actually quite uniformly placed in ideology, political stance, and in many cases they are in completely different positions in relation to everything else but this issue, and so on and so forth. Of course, I think that this is a conversation that has an enormous importance for my mandate, which is created on the very foundation, linguistically, politically, ethically, legally, of gender identity as such, but also because of its practical implications and the practical implications that this conversation appears to have in the construction or dismantling of protection based on the use of this concept. And in particular, I was rather worried about how in international institutions over the last 5 years, one of the main discussions has been to basically take gender out of the discussions of resolutions, treaties, international human rights in general, on the basis of an argument that it's actually not a legally incorporated concept in the framework of international human rights law. And I therefore took the decision after wide consultation. Last year I carried out a consultation that included over 500 persons and institutions coming from over 100 countries on what my thematic priorities should be, and this one appeared always on top of the list. Now, the process did not disappoint. I issued a call for inputs in relation to this report, which was met with almost 600 submissions from individuals, organizations, and states. which I believe is a record-breaking number in terms of submissions in the process of preparation of a report. And not surprisingly, those submissions actually reflected a wide range of opinions and claims and in relation to the extent in which gender has been received and incorporated under international human rights law. The level of response was such that I actually decided to transform one report into two, because the matter that I have to work with was so abundant. And I therefore gave my reporting the design of two reports. They ended up being called, one, the law of inclusion, because in the first part of my inquiry, I carried out an examination following the technical understanding of the way that international human rights law is formed, with particular reference to the statute of the International Court of Justice, famous Article 38, that gives us a guidance under international human rights law about how international human rights law is formed. And following that methodological thread, hopefully presenting in a manner that is not only technically sound, but also clear, an interrogation as to whether one could understand gender as having been part of one such process of creation of international human rights law. And after carrying out that inquiry and examining all of the typical sources of international human rights law, I concluded that gender has been indeed incorporated through a robust process of international human rights law creation, to which we can make reference clearly when doing practical work, not least strategic litigation, but also taking the discussion from the political, the legal, and the sociological analysis perspectives, and so on and so forth. That building block was there, and that was the report that I presented to the Human Rights Council in June of this year. The second part of the report then is the yang to the yin, or perhaps the other side of the coin would be more accurate in relation to this topic, which is, then I examined the narratives and practices of exclusion, which basically argue that gender should be excluded from the framework of international human rights law, or that gender identity should be excluded as a concept in international human rights law, or that even if those are not excluded, that particular communities and populations need to be excluded from the understood scope of those concepts. And this report, entitled Practices of Exclusion, examines subsequently all of these practices and arguments, and finds, from the point of view of sociological analysis, and with reference to legal theory, it finds that, first of all, the exclusionary practices and narratives are, without exception, entering into conflict with international human rights law, which I find to be inclusive in its scope by excellence. And secondly, that in very many cases, they galvanize agendas that appear to be wildly different in origin and scope, and in some cases even as objective, but that reunite around this symbolic vessel of the so-called gender ideology, which evokes a global conspiracy and creates and aims to create a sense of moral panic under the logic that there is a sinister agenda in the insertion of gender or gender identity as concepts utilized to further the rights of communities and populations, not least, of course, women and girls, but also importantly, interlocking in some cases with this, lesbian women, gay men, bisexual, trans, and gender diverse persons, and in some cases, intersex persons. The report, as I said, will be presented to the General Assembly on 26 October of this year, where I expect to have an interactive dialogue with the community of states. My message to them, and with this, Manu, I will finish this initial presentation, is that the design of this report is the result of a deliberate intent on my part to describe two paths that the international community has before it at this time. The first path describes an inclusionary approach that, in my view, results from the best features of international human rights law. This is a discipline that constantly optimizes its capacity to redress injustice and inequality, invisible to previous generations or deliberately made invisible by the actions of previous generations. And the other path describes an exclusionary approach that, in my view, defends orders in which most of the injustice that exists in the world today have been built. And they exploit preconception, stigma, and prejudice and create an atmosphere of panic and moral concern, and in my view, are tools for the perpetuation of violence and discrimination, mostly against women, girls, trans, and intersex persons, as well as gay men and bisexual persons. The inquiry that I carried out in relation to gender also touches upon the significant concern that appears to exist over the challenging of the binary. And I conclude that there is a reason why language is important in relation to this, and it's that just like injustice has been crafted on a binary key over the last many decades, justice has been also expressed in binary terms. And so, of course, there is significant sensations of vertigo when the challenging of the binary appears to seek dismantling all binary structures, because yes, on the one hand, they would aim at destructing injustice, but on the other hand, there is significant concern that it would destroy social achievements that have been also crafted in that key. Let's just think of all of the instruments, treaties, conventions, SDG formulation that have expressed the importance of rights of women and girls. This is essentially a binary key, but of course, one that is fundamental to maintain. My conclusion, if I can express it in a way colloquially, is I think looking beyond the binary doesn't compel us to actually not recognize and maintain the important conquests that are expressed in those terms. It compels us to recognize that binary language is not sufficient to capture all of the diversity of humankind. And I think in that recognition is something where I'm also inviting the international community to develop formulas of progress where we can actually work with this without entrenching ourselves in difficult positions that may very well end up defending things that are contrary to human rights. And again, I think that I go back to the point of that dichotomy. On the one hand, international human rights as the essential instrument for inclusion, and on the other, exclusion being usually the result of practices that are contrary to international human rights. In a nutshell, that is what I think we're working with right now, and what I hope will be a contribution to this essential conversation but from the point of view of a legal analysis that aims at being, that aimed in my work to be evidence-based and dispassionate to the extent that one can be dispassionate in relation to these topics, and very much placing victims of violations of human rights at the center. Thank you very much.
Shall I just carry on now?
Yes, of course.
So I'd just like to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, who've never ceded their lands, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and future. Victor, I think this is a great report, and I really like the way that you've separated the two reports and that you've called this one that we're talking about tonight the law of inclusion. It's very positive and kind of a strong statement. And as Victor has said, you've brought together, Victor, tried to bring all of the gender dimensions of discrimination and violence under the same umbrella, so that we can start to see how they are interrelated and perhaps understand the way that gender works better as a result. Now, my involvement in your report is incredibly tangential, but I just want to describe it a little bit. As I mentioned to Victor before we started, I'm really good friends with Ali Miller, who's also a great colleague of mine over many years, who works at Yale University. And we found ourselves sharing many concerns about the way that gender was being understood in the LGBTIQ rights lobby. And so I got some money together, and Ali came to visit at Melbourne University in 2016, and we wrote a short paper together that put our concerns then more out in the public. And our concerns, there were 4 or 5 main concerns. One, that we wanted to insist that gender identity is something that everyone has, that it's not a category that's confined to trans and or non-binary people, and that we're all equally culturally determined, or everyone's gender identity is equally culturally determined. Secondly, we thought that it was really important to have feminist work on gender as well as LGBTIQ work on gender be talking to each other. Particularly, we were concerned about the definition of gender identity in the Yogyakarta Principles, which talked about gender identity as being deeply personal, internal experience, which really worried us that it wasn't described or understood as being in a cultural and social context. So we were concerned that that gender was becoming biologically determined again, even after all that hard work of feminists on the sort of social construction of gender. Thirdly, we wanted to be very clear that everyone's self-identification of their gender identity should be valued and respected. And fourthly, we wanted to encourage the independent experts. So the position had just been established at the UN to consult with a wide variety of groups working on gender and rights. And finally, we also wanted to emphasize the importance of intersectional approaches. And Victor has certainly picked up on this in his report too. So our next step was to contact the independent expert, and the Victor's predecessor we never heard back from, but Victor did pick up on our communications, and Ali eventually organised a workshop at Yale University in 2018 that Victor participated in, where a range of about a dozen people working in this field with these kind of concerns got together and spent 2 days brainstorming really about this. So the report, from my reading of it, has taken really seriously the kinds of concerns that Ali and I were initially giving voice to, and that were very much extended at the Yale gathering. So I have a couple of questions though, and the first one for you, Victor. The first one is about the definition of gender that you use and how it was received at the Human Rights Council. So let me just tell you what the definition is, and I like it. Victor describes gender as a socio-cultural construct that describes certain roles, behaviours, forms of expression, activities and attributes determined to be appropriate according to the meaning given to biological sex characteristics. So there's two social constructions going on there. The meaning that we socially give to sex characteristics that then precipitates the meaning, the attribution of certain roles and behaviours. And I know years ago, the Special Rapporteur on Protecting Human Rights while Countering Terrorism presented a report that used not this definition, I think this is a better definition, Victor, but a definition of gender that wasn't confined to gender duality and indicated gender was a cultural construction. And he got pilloried, really. The response from so many states was incredibly hostile, and it even descended into very personal insults. So shall I ask my second question, Victor, as well, or do you want to answer that first? Yes, maybe you answer that first, if you would. Oh, you're still muted, Victor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me now.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Dianne. And the reason why I would actually really love to answer that question now is because you have elicited like 12 different thoughts in my head. So I want to make sure that I don't lose them, but I will try to be as succinct as possible. Thank you, by the way, for that question, which I really think it's important. So let me try and make what I think are 3 essential points, and hopefully you'll tell me to what extent I've answered your question. Let me go to the very specific about the way that this was, I would say, crafted. Thank you for your kind words in relation to this definition. And the reason why I can actually thank you with a clear conscience is this was the result of a process, of a deep listening process where elements of this definition have been provided with by so many persons with lived experiences and theoreticians and this and that, that I just basically see myself as one of those craftsmen that is taking like pieces of tiles and then putting something together that seems to have some coherence in relation to this. And I do think that it actually aims at describing a good relationship, but the essential autonomy between the concepts of sex characteristics and gender as functioning autonomously, as relating to the construction of experiences of privilege or discrimination in relation to this, which I think is the essence of the beginning of an intersectional approach, which is what I learned in that listening session and afterwards in relation to all of these issues. Now, what I think is important in relation to this is that part of the strategy that aims to destruct the applicability of gender internationally seeks to say that gender and sex are being conflated and that gender is seeking to erase sex. And to me, what is important is to acknowledge that there are certain sex characteristics that are, of course, physical realities in the body of every person, but that it is the meaning, and this does the part that I think it's an inclusion, the meaning attributed to that physical reality can vary wildly, and the policing of that meaning can be devastating in the life experience of everyone. And to me, this is the concept that I think brings clarity to that relation and places those two dimensions in a way where they are perfectly compatible as they are in the everyday life of every person who lives in a gendered society, which, as we know, is every person in the world. Because I have not found even one shred of evidence that there's a person that lives in a non-gendered society as of today. This brought me also to the understanding that the idea of furthering an understanding of gender as this framework, this concept, would be also essential to dismantle toxic masculinities, which is, of course, something that I think it's a big part of the equation, and where I am very much hoping to operate in the fact that without having the concerns of women and girls at the forefront, because we know that they are, of course, disproportionately impacted by violence and discrimination, we understand that gender lies also at the source of a number of processes that we need to look at if we really want to do a holistic, if one would use the word, treatment in relation to this. And with this, I will kind of get to the last part of your question, I believe, Dianne, which is, once this was crafted, there was also for me the understanding that one of the risks in international discourse was the fact that there appears to be a popular understanding that gender and gender identity are two different things. And I think the risk that you mentioned about how this dissociation suddenly began to say, okay, women have gender and trans persons have gender identity, and this is different. And I think legally there's no foundation for that construction. There is the foundation of understanding that everybody has a gender, everybody lives in a gendered society. And in particular cases, the experience of gender, which has internal and external dimensions, very much as you mentioned, actually enters into particular risk of violence and discrimination because of the things that it challenges in a particular context. And that's the articulation that I find actually to have been received in different legal theory, not least my inquiry very much also focused to the developments of international and regional tribunals, as well as, of course, as the authorized publicists. Again, I mean, this is pure legal analysis based on the process of formation of international law. When I presented this, then I have to tell you, I was met with a very constructive and very vibrant dialogue with states. Now, I think that you could attribute that to two things. Since this is an academic conversation, I will allow myself to be a bit more academic than political. The mandate enjoys the support of a significant number of countries now that have seen the evidence as to how these frameworks provide real keys to unlocking an understanding of how violence occurs. And I think that development, which I think the mandate is a part of, but it belongs to a complex system of thinkers and judges and advocates and human rights defenders, I think it's galvanizing an understanding that we cannot go back in our understanding of these issues. And so the dialogue was constructive. I also think that maybe those that take issue with it come from a different point of departure, which is not necessarily strictly legal in its construction. And this is why, for me, it was really important to divide the report and to first present an argument that was absolutely legal only in nature. Because I wanted the conversation to be only relating to that aspect of things, the legal theory. Then we can talk about the political and the social and the, but my business, if I may say like that, is the business of law. And I wanted to speak in the business of law. And I am convinced, I mean, I'm always humbled that I may be wrong, but I am convinced that when it comes to the law includes, and the law seeks concepts to deconstruct violence, and that gender has clearly gained a space under this framework that is very solid.
Oh, that's so interesting, Victor. And to me, it also indicates that some of the hostility, well, the report I spoke about was 10 years ago. So that over a decade, there has been some movement at the council. My other question relates a bit to something you said about gender and gender identity basically meaning the same thing. And that's about the proliferation of recognised grounds of discrimination. So in your report, you talk about gender, gender identity, gender expression, sex, sex characteristics, and you talk also about sexual orientation and so on. But my question really is, and I know each of these terms has their own history. So that's something, you don't want the history to disappear. But at the same time, why do you think, well, why didn't you suggest that we just replace gender with gender identity and sex with sex characteristics?
That's a very good question. And again, a lot more perhaps in the realm of the political and the strategic rather than necessarily the only legal, which of course is one of the building blocks, but that needs to be reconciled with everything else. A number of things. I'm going to share this very, very informally. I'll say, meaning a bit more disorderly than normal, because you elicit again a lot of thoughts in my head. I think that the evolution of the term gender identity is actually quite fascinating, and if anybody in this conversation is actually seeking for a wonderful topic for what really could be like an anthropological, almost geological study of how different layers of political understanding comes through, gender identity is a good idea. I have been let know by feminist thinkers who have been working on this field for a very long time that gender identity was originally one of the tools created within feminist thinking and the theory of gender to describe experiences connected to gender by women. And that the term was crafted within this particular context, and relating very much to this, to one of the dimensions, but also to the fact that that dimension, which is, as I said, has an internal component, externalizes a number of issues and belongs to the social in also a number of manifestations which relate to privilege and violence. So it appears also that at some point in time, this particular concept was politically evolving to describe particular experiences of trans persons. And it became politically associated in many cases with only trans persons. And Dianne, I don't know whether you would be, but I will use the expression, you would be surprised the amount of states and non-state actors that said to me, oh, no, Victor, don't confuse things. Women have gender, trans people have gender identity. You know, these are completely separate things. And same thing, of course, same type, perhaps, of process. Sex, of course, is very strongly connected to the binary, whereas sex characteristics are actually reflecting, in my view, the texture and the nuance of the reality of existence of intersex persons. And of course, one could use one term or the other, but what I find is that a lot of the opposition arguments is precisely trying to ignore the substance. One of the traits that I find is shared by the tactical and strategic approaches of anti-gender, anti-gender identity, anti-rights, finally, discourses, is the simplicity of messages. Could you take, issue with a message that, takes 2 words and says sex matters? Well, it's hard because, of course, it's a very simplistic. But of course, when you explore what that is aiming at describing, that is in fact a very non-nuanced approach to human life. It's like in Spanish and in Latin America, the very catchy slogan of "do not mess with my children." Of course, you cannot take issue with that. Nobody wants to mess with children. But when you realize that the intent of that is to signal that every gay man is a pedophile, or that every person who advocates for the ability, incremental capacity of children to relate to gender is a person that wants to castrate infants, then you realize what is behind that. And so the reason why I didn't go the route of simplicity, although that's always my temptation, is I think we need to live in the complexity and the texture of things. And when I am firmly convinced that gender identity and gender expression are in fact dimensions that relate inextricably to gender, I would still want to say the words because I want to signal nuance. Mm-hmm. And I am sure, Dianne, that in 25 years, we will be able to do exercises where we close kind of this nuance into wonderful simplicities. But I think we are at the unpacking stage, and the messy unpacking stage where we're going to have to say more words because the catchy slogan is not our tactic.
And on.
Thank you so much for this conversation. It was really, really fascinating, I think. Thank you for your questions, Dianne. We have 2 questions in the chat, and I think that they are a great follow-up to what has just been said. So I'm gonna ask them right now, and I think I'm gonna ask them together. So there is Gustavo, who asks whether law would not have a limit to recognize gender identity issues and to repair the historical colonial violence that is perpetrated nowadays against gender non-conforming people, especially with regard to social and collective rights. And then we have Rohini, whose question is the opposite. So Rohini is asking, given law's capacity to self-define and define broadly, is it not within its power to say what is not, and what else it wants to be, especially if it wants to mold itself to repair historical colonial violence and erasure of identities? It's in the chat if you want to read them, because I know that it's a bit long. And maybe if Dianne, you want to start?
I'm sure Victor would agree actually, but we'll see in a minute. Of course, law has its limits. And one of the other things I liked about Victor's report, and also what he's been saying this evening, is that he's very attentive to social movements, especially, you know, grassroots experiences. And in fact, I thought the last paragraph in Victor's conclusions was fantastic. He said that communities of activists teach us the importance of seeing each other, listening to each other, and acting towards each other with kindness and compassion, and that this inclusivity is at the core of safeguarding the common heritage built by our elders and the extraordinary power of a movement that has achieved so much and is currently at such risk. But the law is one aspect of our social environment, our political environment, and we definitely, well, I think every thing that we ask of the law comes from the movements and the experiences of those people who are marginalised and experiencing the discrimination and violence that we're trying to confront and change. Law also has a limit in that it has a colonial history, human rights law. There have been many efforts, and there continue to be efforts to decolonise human rights law, just in the same way as there are efforts to increase the inclusivity of human rights generally, of women, Indigenous peoples, and as well as people marginalised because of their gender or sexual orientation. Social and collective rights, yes, they are also continuing struggles. And I think that Victor's work and the work of us generally as activists and legal scholars and teachers should be seen as contributing to these movements for change within international human rights law, in full recognition, really, of its limits, but limits that we need to push at. And I think post-colonial or the movements for decolonisation are a very good example of movements that were pushing at the limits of the law even that long ago, and how important that is. The second question, I didn't, it's the opposite capacity. I'm not sure that the law is very good at defining. I mean, it's good at, it is very good at defining in an exclusionary way. Its definitions are always too specific, well, not always, but tend to be too specific, and its definitions need constant attention and constant rewriting, really, in order to be more inclusive. And its definitions are powerful, and especially in an exclusionary way. Sorry, I haven't quite understood this question though, so I'll pass it over to Victor, and thanks, Manuel.
I'm going to build up on Dianne's answer, because I actually very much agree on her assessment about this very complex reality that we cannot describe with a three-letter word, right? Law. We cannot just imagine that we're saying good law or bad law or colonial law or so again, we need to unpack. And so let me try to do a little bit of unpacking, but it won't be everything. I look forward to continuing the discussion. A couple of topics seem very important to me in what this question is asking. When I describe the law of inclusion, I am describing a particular process within international human rights law where I see that a number of international human rights instruments are being used as tools to interpret, to analyze, and to address violence and discrimination. But of course, there are 69 countries today, that's 2,000 million people, that live in environments criminalized by law. And criminalizing legislation is by definition exclusionary. It means gay people or lesbians or trans or gender diverse are the other, the antisocial, the alien, the one that goes against our national project, the one that wishes us harm. So of course that's exclusionary thinking, right? This is not one of us. And so I think that we need to understand that the law is just an instrument, and of course it adapts to certain means. I am at the moment commenting vigorously on the draft legislation in Ghana, where, I mean, if you ever need a textbook example of how legislation can be crafted into a system of state oppression, look at the Ghanaian draft legislation. It criminalizes further gay men, lesbian women, trans persons. It criminalizes everyone who is exploring their sexuality. So, I mean, all of Ghana is going to jail, as far as I'm concerned. And then in an exercise of cruelty that I simply cannot begin to understand, it criminalizes intersex persons because of their sex characteristics. So it says that intersex persons must now, be considered criminals. I mean, replace sex characteristics with race, and what do you have? It's to me mind-boggling. And so, to the dear colleagues that were asking these questions, is the law is not in itself fair. The law must be coupled with objectives and the process. And this is my second part. The reason why I place a lot of emphasis on human rights-based approaches is because human rights-based approaches tend to remedy a number of flaws in lawmaking processes. Participation of the concerned communities in the lawmaking process is key. Empowerment of the concerned communities. Use of evidence-based approaches. Acknowledgement of the existence of, in this case, LGBT people, but in other cases, other identities that we can reunite in one body. So I created, for example, the Aspire framework, which is a framework trying to explain to states how you can run these processes in a way that is human rights compliant. Aspire stands for acknowledge LGBT people, support LGBT organizations, protect LGBT people from persecution. Indirect discrimination is a risk, bring it into your risk assessment. Representation in the process is key. And finally, evidence-based approaches are fundamental. So all of this is part of what I think is good process making, and that applies to public policy and to law. And to me, that is very much speaking to the capacity of the law to say what is not, and what it means it wants to be. Well, what it is must correspond to an objective reality. It cannot correspond to a preconceived, stigmatizing notion of things, such as is the example of criminalizing legislation. One last thing, mention was made of reparations. I do not begin to wrap my mind around what this may mean in relation to sexual orientation, gender identity, and colonialism. But thankfully, I do not need yet, because I am going to be preparing a report on colonialism to present to the Human Rights Council in 2023. The work has started, so just to let you know, my aim has always been to put building blocks so that everybody in this complex system, including human rights defenders, thinking, theorists, advocates, can use those building blocks. And as you know, we've issued reports on criminalization and pathologization and conversion practices, and now we have these ones on gender. There's going to be one on religion and one on colonialism. And I'm hoping to understand the meaning of all of these issues in the context of that inquiry, which would come out in 2023. At the moment, what we know is that there is an unfortunate trend in countries that maintain colonially imposed standards to actually defend them as if they were their own. When you speak to Caribbean governments, they will invariably tell you, oh, we do not take out the criminalization provisions in the Constitution because that has become part of our national identity now. And of course, I find that quite bizarre, but okay, that's a different question, I guess.
Dianne, you're muted.
I see that Rohini has clarified her question, so if I could just make a quick comment on that. Thanks, Rohini. Yes, I see what you mean. The thing is that the law is not an objective or neutral discourse. It certainly is a site of power, and it's a site of power that largely serves the privileged. But that's not to say that that's always a fait accompli. It is, as a site of power, it's also a site of struggle. And that's where we come in, where we're really important. And that's where, so this site of struggle is, I think, the way to think about the law. It doesn't move on its own motion. It moves because of the people involved in it. As you know, classical legal education doesn't encourage critique, doesn't encourage looking behind the received wisdom of the law as we've inherited it. So that that's what we have to do, is, you know, engage so that those voices that have been excluded or considered not fully human, so not even seen, can be heard. Okay, hope that helps, Rohini.
Thank you very much to both of you. I will make a last call for questions because we still have around 10 minutes. And I will ask a question to Dianne, and then I will continue with a question from Damien to Victor for the moment. So Dianne, I think now it's a time to bring a queer perspectives into all this, because this is part of a workshop on queer methods. And as a scholar who works on law, on the theory of gender, but also on civil society initiatives, practice at the UN, I wanted to ask you whether and how you think about practice and theory in a kind of queer way. Can we blur the boundaries between practice and theory, and how do you envision it in your work?
Well, practice and theory are another binary that I think has not served us well, because it has led to there often being a chasm between those of us who see ourselves as working primarily in theory, though I think of myself as an activist at the same time as I'm engaging with theory. So I don't really have that disconnect, but that's also because I've been an activist for a very long time, much longer than I've been an academic. So that helps. But let me just think about queer though. So queer for me is not just about, though this is important, it's partly about bringing, making visible and making making visible the heteronormative underpinnings of
Right.
the law that presents itself as neutral and objective, so that we see whose interests, it's clearer, whose interests are being served. But I think queer is also, so it's about destabilizing what's been taken to be natural and constantly being skeptical or cautious about any use of the word natural. But I also think queer is about imagining about the kind of future or life now that we'd like to be living. So it gives us a sense of solidarity, even though we might have quite different views about the future, but a sense of belief, I suppose, that we can create a better world, a world in which there aren't marginalized people, but, you know, where a redistributive kind of world in all sorts of ways, where our relationships with each other matter more than money or weapons or many other terrible things that we're involved in the world today. So queer for me is about, you know, imagination, about dreaming of better futures, and as well as linking with, making sure that our work links with activists and with people's experience in their diverse experiences in their everyday lives.
Thank you so much for this beautiful, beautiful response. Victor, so there is a question from Damien who asks, what do you think is the scope and the limits of the mandate itself to incorporate queer theory as an intellectual tool for understanding sexual and gender discrimination? It transpires from the reports that queer theory is having an impact in the understanding, particularly of genders, but perhaps has not gone yet as far as the inter-American bodies had, especially the Commission at the time that coincidentally you were working there. And he's thanking both Dianne and Victor for this great conversation.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that question. Let me make two preliminary statements on this. I didn't come to this field from the point of view of theory. I've never been a queer theoretician, if that is the right expression. I came to it from the angle of practice, which means that there was a huge learning curve, because having worked at international and regional tribunals and then from civil society activism, I benefited enormously from the theoretical and intellectual constructions around this field, but it was always in a very instrumental way. There's a number of phenomena that one wishes to understand, and then of course this is the moment where thinkers, theoreticians can come and present frameworks where you can unlock certain processes and actually make them flow through a decision-making process, which will make them concrete, legal, political, you know, be it a resolution of the UN or a resolution at the OAS or a report of the Commission or a judgment of the court, and so on and so forth. And so this is why I benefited enormously from exposure to this field of development. But I would agree that it's never been within, let's say, my point of entry to actually make a full incorporation into my work of a whole stream of consciousness, if I can describe it like that, relating to queer theory. And that's because I see my job as independent expert, I see my value added in terms of the legal analysis. And this has to do with the way in which the mandate was created. You will remember that in 2016, when the mandate was created, it was created under huge controversy and only with 4 votes in favor than those that didn't want it to exist, right? And so I promised everyone, civil society and governments and this and that I would take a very, very boring approach to the mandate, and I would only focus on the law, because that is what exactly I was being told to do, the law, focus on the law. And it's been a formula that I think has allowed states to also take a very firm grasp of the way that the legal theory is being presented. And hopefully it contributed, along with the work of civil society, to the renewal of the mandate in conditions that were completely different, which is with a lot of votes in favor and no regional opposition, consensus in opposition. So all of this to tell you, it's been a lot more determined by legal connectivity, strategic thinking, and in some cases, tactical thinking. I think that at some point, it could be quite interesting to ask oneself whether there would be a mandate holder or a mandate whose job would be to explore more of these aspects. And on this, I would like to share this. But I mean, of course, the underlying premise is this is also always going to be incorporated and received in my work as long as I see a connection with this strong legal pillar kind of methodological. That leads me to another question, which is something that I wanted to share with you, but for which I have no answer. I just think it's an interesting and important conversation that may have a bearing also in relation to that question, and it's the following. We speak a lot of intersectionality, and I think that this is one of the basic features of the disciplines in which we all work. We make the political statement that we work intersectionally and that it is our determination and our firm political determination to work intersectionally. But of course, what does this mean is a lot more difficult to actually understand. I mean, does it mean that I have a paragraph concerning different populations and communities in each one of my reports? Is that my methodological understanding? Does it mean that I actually now need to begin to explore different levels of the many identities that we reunite in one body? And more importantly, is intersectionality a purely sociological endeavor? Is it political? Is it anthropological? Or are there dimensions to intersectionality that are also purely legal? Can I find intersectionality in the law in any way, shape, or form? And I'm beginning that interrogation by, for example, looking at data gathering processes and the extent to which data is designed by law to be intersectional or not, for example. And then going on to, you know, the systematization of that data and so on and so forth. To me, this is the next generation of questions that we're facing. And one where I find that the texture and the beauty of this mandate, since reference was made to the scope of the mandate, is that it was established in such a way that it really allows to bring in all of those concepts in a perfectly legitimate way. Because I am being asked to explore root causes and solutions. And the queer theory is, of course, part of the way where we are trying to articulate an understanding of the reality. And so I think it is 100% within the scope of the mandate. When the Inter-American Commission began working on these issues, it was around 2009. Those of you that were there or close to there will remember that civil society did a fantastic work of political incidents, and the General Assembly of the OAS issued a series of resolutions, but one particular in 2008 when it asked the Inter-American Commission to occupy itself of the rights of LGBTI persons. And the Commission then moved on to create a specialized approach. But as is pointedly and aptly mentioned by our colleague, I think that it was a learning curve for the Commission as well. When we began working on this issue, I was the technical advisor creating the unit and eventually the rapporteurship. we really needed to begin to incorporate a number of these issues. And it is only now, I think, after probably 13 years of work, that there is more of a solid kind of theoretical construct that is constantly informing the Commission. But this is the way international law evolves as well. And one of the things that I would remark on that process is that there was such strong and vibrant participation of concerned populations and communities that it describes one of those processes that was well informed by the reality of things and by the voices of those who were usually at the outside of the room when it came to the process. Long rambling, Manu, I'm sorry.
No, it was very interesting. Thank you. We have 2 more questions. Do you mind? I ask both speakers if I ask these questions, which means that we would finish in 10 minutes, I guess. Yes?
I would be happy to extend for 10 minutes. I'm more concerned about Dianne.
Exactly, because it starts to be really late. Okay, so I will start with Emily's question. It's a bit long, so I'm really sorry, Emily. I will try to cut it a little bit shorter. I hope that I will make justice to it. But Emily has a question about mainstreaming the definition of gender across the UN and the law. And she's wondering whether we can tackle the backlash led by gender critical ideologies through so in the field of human rights law. I start again. How can we tackle this backlash in the field of human rights and seek to push back against so-called gender critical ideologies? Do you think strategically that the best way to tackle this is through the law and legal definitions, or are there other actions we can or we should take? For instance, zero tolerance policy regarding transphobia at the United Nations, or more work on mainstreaming sexual orientation and gender identity rights. Mm-hmm. So maybe Victor, if you, no, Dianne, please, you can.
Oh no, I was going to say, let's see what Victor has to say about this. But I certainly think that legal definitions nevertheless have some power. And that's partly why I like Victor's intervention here, because it is a tool that one can use then domestically to help to strengthen the arguments against the biological determinism. But it's back to people's movements. It's back to also, the law isn't going to do it by itself, and the law won't be implemented or really have an impact on people's lives unless people support it. So it's a struggle on many fronts. But Victor, what do you think?
Well, I'll try to be as succinct as I can, which by now you have realized it's a talent that I don't really have. But so trying to be very quick. The law is, of course, a fundamental tool. Other tools were mentioned, like policies of zero transphobia, yes. But of course, then we get into the question of implementation. And this is what I wanted to make as my main point in relation to this answer. I think that mainstreaming is a great process to signal a political intention to recognize an issue as belonging to the whole host of United Nations family rather than the small redux of only the human rights pillar, right? The work for the next decade is to make sure that there is a nuanced understanding of gender as not meaning women, but actually being a powerful instrument to understand how injustice and how power is structured into asymmetries that end up affecting women for the most part or disproportionately. I think it was Dianne that was saying that, however, there are many other factors that actually end up placing most of the world population in a situation of disadvantage, and that end up benefiting the very, very few. And gender plays a powerful role in that, by making sure that, at the outset, half of the world population is already kind of cast aside. And then we have other factors playing. And of course, the other aspect of this is women are not a monolithic, completely hegemonious group. There's women in all of their diversity and all of their kind of, all of their diversity. So to me, the work of defining legally some of those issues is probably not very useful, because I think the law should establish some principles, such as non-discrimination and recognition of gender as a human experience. Let's say as a concept and a framework that describes certain aspects of human experience. But then the work of nuancing that, I think it's important to mainstream it throughout the UN in political, programmatic, and monitoring and evaluation frameworks. And this is what we're trying to do. I'm trying to make a contribution to that work. My contribution is rather specific, but I think it's what agencies like UNFPA and UN Women are doing through their resolve of inserting this understanding of gender all throughout. It's going to be a bit more complicated to do it in agencies such as, that are more peripheral to the idea of human rights, but we are working towards that. Last week, Volker Turk announced an initiative that actually seeks to mainstream all of these concerns throughout the UN family. We've been working on that for a long time. I'm advising that process. So I think that it really is at the question of inserting at every level a nuanced understanding, and clearly the other aspect. And with this, I finish. One of the reasons why I did this report is because I know that certain governments have issued instructions to their diplomatic agents to take away the word gender from any resolution and any treaty negotiation and any international instrument, and to replace it with equality between the sexes. Therefore, conflating the notion of gender and sex, and of course, as I say in my report, and that's my working theory, I hope to hear what you will think about it, but my theory is we must recognize that they exist as autonomous, and that part of the nuance is to recognize their coexistence in this legal framework.
Thank you. We have a last question that is actually very much related to this, by Evelyn, who takes us to certain countries, like in Ghana, for instance, where there is an idea that discrimination is part of cultural identities, and this seems to have taken root in the African region. So the question is whether there is a duty of the international community to prevent this. I think that you already kind of started to reply. Maybe you could say a few words about this question precisely, and then we will stop the station for today.
Can we do the reverse exercise? Can I say a very quick couple of words, and then because I think that this is Dianne's kind of super field. So is that all right with you, Dianne?
Victor, yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, did you hear what I said, that I would try to say a couple of words, but then I think this is Dianne's super field, and I certainly think that she should have the definitive word on this issue. I know she's been thinking about this in a lot more apt way than I could ever dream to. I'm not being political. I really believe so. So just a couple of things. Unfortunately, I think that, I mean, in my experience, what is a part of culture is defined very much by who is controlling the narrative. I mean, that's a kind of made up phrase, but I think it's actually really, really clear. The question is not necessarily whether things happen in culture, because of course discrimination and violence happen in culture. Toxic masculinities are part of culture. Racism is part of. The question is whether this is what should be happening and whether we actually must take remedial measures. So when I look at a country like Ghana, where, as you know, I've been working very intensely to try and relate to this law, my question is not whether there's a conducive cultural context to it, because in a way there is. I mean, and this is the case in Hungary, it's the case in Poland, it's the case in so many countries in Latin America, where LGBT lives are being instrumentalized by politicians as a way to galvanize their political bases. The question is, how do we take remedy against that and make it improper politically as well? And that's where we're all working for. But I'm fascinated to hear what Dianne might have to say about that.
Well, I don't know that this is my kind of where I'm super, where I've got a super answer. But the first thing is that culture isn't a monolithic thing. Traditional cultures change all the time. I agree that some governments use this idea of traditional values, and unfortunately some of the resolutions in the last decade at the Human Rights Council have also galvanized some states around this idea of traditional values in response to the SOGI mandate, as well as response to women's rights. But there are many influences, not just governments, and in particular the fundamentalist Christians, especially from the US, have been very instrumental in promoting homophobic and transphobic attitudes as traditional values in some countries. But I also think, like Victor's saying more generally, we shouldn't think of Africa as a single, entity here, that there's diversity amongst the different regions and between particular states. And even though South Africa comes and goes a bit, they have constitutional protection of discrimination, specific, explicit constitutional protection relating to sexual orientation. The African Commission on Human and People's Rights has also adopted a very important kind of general recommendation on SOGI that condemns SOGI discrimination and violence. And a number of human rights commissions across Africa are working very solidly on this issue, as well as, of course, many people's movements. So I'm not sure that, well, another way in which resistance to SOGI developments is framed by those who don't support them is that this is Western bourgeois decadence, ideas that are being coming from the corrupt West, although they forget that Latin American countries, as Victor's been acknowledging, are very important in this space, probably more important than the West in some ways. So, I mean, it's all part of what we face. And again, I think Victor's report at the Human Rights Council, where a lot of these hostilities actually come, are expressed, is so important. So I'd like to just thank Victor again for this work. And I love the idea that you're going to do some work on using post-colonial perspectives too.
Thank you so much to Dianne and to Victor. I think I will finish with a quote that has been said today. We are at the unpacking stage, so we need more words. It's beautiful. And on this note, I wish all of you a beautiful morning for Victor, night for Dianne, and afternoon for the people in Geneva or whatever. Thank you so much for being here with us for this 1 hour and a half in the end. Thank you for extending your time. And I hope to see you very soon at other events. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dianne. Thank you warmly.
Thanks,
Huh? Thank
Great
you,
to meet
Manon.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.